Farmer George Plants a Nation by Peggy Thomas, paintings by Lane Johnson. Standing a head taller than his field hands, George scanned the distant land, imagining how much tobacco, corn, and wheat it would produce. He had always loved Mount Vernon, even before his half-brother Lawrence named the estate after Admiral Edward Vernon, a great British naval officer. George remembered living there as a boy, running after the chickens and following Lawrence as he inspected the fields. In 1759, at the age of 27, George was the master of the estate. He had just returned home from 4 years of fighting in the French and Indian War. Being commander-in-chief of Virginia's troops was difficult, but young George learned to lead and make decisions with confidence. Now that he was home, he had his lovely wife, Martha, 2 stepchildren to care for, and a busy plantation to run. How would this poor soil grow crops he needed to feed his family and slaves and earn money at the market too? George had learned a lot watching Lawrence, but he needed to know more to make his plantation successful.
So he penned a letter to England, ordering the best books of agriculture, including Batty Lingley's New Principles of Gardening. These books would not have all the answers George needed. They were based on what worked for British farmers. George would need to see for himself which seeds would grow well in Mount Vernon, hard clay soil and warm Virginia climate. One blustery day in March, George watched as the hands planted crops. One guided a wheel plow, turning over clods of dirt, and second slave walked behind, scattering handfuls of barley seed. A third field hand covered the seeds with soil using a sharp harrow. There had to be a better way, George thought. Later he wrote in his diary, "Spent the greatest part of my day in making a new plow of my own invention, 1760. For one of his new plows, he found a barrel and punched holes slightly bigger than a seed into the side. Then he fastened the barrel to the top of the plow. Now, as the field hand guided the plow forward, the barrel turned as the plow cut the earth. Seeds dropped out of the barrel's small holes, tumbled down a chute, and fell into the tilled ground in neat rows. A harrow attached to the back of the plow covered the seeds with soil. George was delighted. His new plow did 3 jobs at once, saving the time and energy.
The plow helped his field hands plant faster, but nothing helped the tired soil recover from years of planting tobacco. Tobacco was a harsh crop that soaked up all the soil's nutrients. Other plantation owners planted tobacco in the same field year after year until the soil was too weak to nurture more seeds. Then they abandoned the field, moved to a new plot, and started all over again. Such a waste, George thought. Instead, he rotated the crops he grew within a single field and experimented with different fertilizers. He tested soil and manure in his little garden, nestled between the salt house and the upper garden wall. He rolled up his sleeves and drilled holes in the soil, precisely measuring the distance between them. Rather than use a proper label, George marked each row with a notched stick and kept track in his diary of what each marking meant. He mixed different composted soils in a large wooden box that was divided into sections. He would toss horse manure in one part, cow manure in the second part, and sheep manure in another. That sounds really smelly. Then he would plant the same number of seeds in each section. Each day he would check on his experiment and write down what he saw. Which sprouts broke the soil first? How healthy did they look, and how fast did they grow? The best fertilizers were then used in the big fields. George believed that every experiment is a treasure, and he enjoyed sharing the results of his experiments with guests and neighbors who visited. They had the same problems.
His dinner guests also complained about how expensive it was to ship their tobacco to England. They groaned about the new taxes they were forced to pay to the King of England, a tax on sugar, a tax on tea, on glass, paint, and lead. There was even a special stamp required for newspapers and documents. It seemed unfair for the colonists to pay such a high taxes when they had no voice in the British government. George agreed. Each year he planted less and less tobacco, so he did not have to ship it to England. Instead, he grew more and more wheat to sell to other colonists, potatoes, turnips, and other vegetables to feed his household, and flax to make cloth. Soon, Mount Vernon was like a little village.
Striding down the North Lane, George could hear the whir of the spinning wheels and the thwack of the looms as slaves and hired weavers wove cloth for blankets and clothing. Tap, tap, tap sounded the shoemaker's hammer, and a loud clanging from the blacksmith's anvil echoed up from the stables. Nothing was purchased from England that could be made at Mount Vernon. As George made Mount Vernon less dependent on English goods, the colonists' grumblings grew louder. It was time for the colonies to break away from England, too. Although George loved Mount Vernon, too many people were calling for him to leave home to lead the colonies as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He could not refuse. In June 1775, General George Washington rode off to train his troops to fight the British. When he left, George thought, as all the soldiers did, that he would be home by Christmas. He would not live at Mount Vernon again for more than 8 years. No matter where he was, George's thoughts were never far from home. When he was huddled in a drafty tent overlooking a battlefield, or at a desk in a crowded inn, General George found time to write lengthy letters to his farm managers back home. The longest were 16 pages. Days before leading rows of soldiers into battle, he eased his mind by imagining where to plant rows of fruit trees. He wrote his cousin Lund of his plans. "I mean to have groves of trees at each end of the dwelling house, to range in a line from southeast corner to Colo Fairfax's. And from his dismal makeshift headquarters in New Windsor, New York, he could imagine a brighter future at home."
Finally, on Christmas Eve, 1783, a victorious George Washington trotted up the road to Mount Vernon. He had won the war and now looked forward to living as a simple farmer again. But his farms looked shabby and his fields looked tired. He tried new mixes of fertilizer, plaster of Paris, black muck from the swamp, and fish heads. He even looked into pulling mud from the bottom of the Potomac River with a new machine called the hippopotamus.
George may have missed being a general, though, for he plotted and planted trees as if they were soldiers on the battlefield. Redbud and dogwood trees guarded the house. Magnolias and black locusts shielded the servants' quarters, and weeping willows and oaks stood sentinel along the roads. And wherever he traveled, he brought back a pocketful of seeds or nuts to experiment with. Each day he would record his work in his diary.
After the war, he did not have much time to plant or experiment. He was the hero. People wanted to meet him, shake his hand, and ask him his advice. Guests arrived almost every day. Many brought gifts. His friends knew just what he liked. I received with great pleasure and gratitude the seeds of any tree or shrubs, and not natives of this country. But the strangest gift clip-clopped up the steps of Mount Vernon on December 5th, 1785. It was a prize male donkey from King Charles III of Spain. Its handler, Pedro Tellez, had walked the donkey all the way from Boston, where they landed after a long trip across the Atlantic Ocean. George was pleased with the large and powerful animal that he called it royal gift. A year later, his friend Marquis de Lafayette of France sent him 2 female donkeys and another male donkey, called Knight of Malta. Farmer George bred the male donkeys with female horses to create some of the finest American mules. He believed that every farmer should use mules because they are stronger than horses and more agile than oxen. Soon many American farmers would have one.
Farmer George spread the news about the powerful mules and shared all he learned about crops and fertilizers with other farmers. He believed that all his experiments and each improvement he made at Mount Vernon would benefit everyone. America needed many successful farmers in order to grow into a successful nation. Even though he was no longer an army general, he was still leading the way by his actions and words. In 1789, his leadership was made official again. George Washington was elected the first president of the United States of America. On April 16, 1789, he stepped into his carriage and took one last look at his quiet countryside home. Days later, he arrived in the bustling new capital, New York City, to take oath of office and invent the job of president. He chose judges, picked cabinet members, and approved laws. He visited each new state, talking to governors, mayors, and of course, farmers, to share what he knew and learn about their problems.
At the same time he was building a new government, President George Washington took time to think about buildings on his farm. From his presidential desk, he designed a barn like no other. He had 16 sides and was 2 stories tall. He designed it so his workers could tread wheat inside during bad weather. When wheat was harvested, the grains had to be separated from the stalks by treading or walking on it. The workers would usually do the outside on the ground in good weather or bad. This bothered George. When he sent plans for the construction of the treading barn to his farm manager at Mount Vernon, he ordered the brickmakers to fashion 30,820 bricks. He chose to build the barn out of the side of the hill so that horses could be led in and out onto an earthen ramp. When workers no longer shredded the wheat, horses would. The horses would trot in a circle on the upper level instead of a solid wood floor. George designed a floor with sturdy slats placed 1.5 inches apart. It was safe enough for horses and allowed the small grains of wheat to fall through the cracks to the floor below. There, workers shoveled the grain and placed it into bags for grinding.
George was president for 8 years and defined what it meant to hold that office. But in 1797, it was time for George to go home. No longer general, no longer president, he was just Farmer George. He counted and inspected his livestock and kept his eye on the army. He continued to give advice to other farmers and occasionally gave advice to the new president. He managed his farms, pottered his little garden, and wrote in his diary.
1799, 2 days before he died. He noted that it was wet, cold, and snowy. But George did what all farmers do. He rode out to inspect his fields. It would be his last time.
George once wrote, "I hope, someday or another, we shall become a storehouse and a granary for the world." And because of George Washington, we are. He planted the seed of freedom on the battlefield, and his ingenuity as a farmer, and his leadership as the nation's first president, the United States grew into a world leader in farming. Until the end, General, President, Farmer, George Washington led his country by example. Hi guys, the fine people that you got that book read to was by me, Janae Sears, Olivia Piper, and Elena Wazalewski. We would have loved to be in person to read this book to you, but because of the circumstances, we had to do this awesome online version.
Hey guys, I'm Elena Wazalewski. You should all receive your own version of the book we just read to you, and they should all have messages written by the freshman ag students in them. So go and check those out. I'm sure they're really cool, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it.